Good evening, aviation aficionados far and wide. I'm Jamie Beckett, AOPA Foundation's You Can Fly Ambassador to the Eastern U.S., and this is Ask an Ambassador, where you get to ask CFIs anything you want, although we have a plan. And tonight, we're going to be talking about lessons learned from the right seat. All of the ambassadors are flight instructors. We've all got years of experience doing it, and sometimes we learn something that we can pass along. With me on this journey will be my good pal, Kay Sundrum, way over there in California, and Pat Brown from Texas. Pat takes care of the central U.S. Kay's got the West Coast. And between us, we probably have an idea on most things. 7 o'clock on the East Coast, Pat. 4 o'clock on the West Coast, Kay. I think we probably got a fair amount of stuff to share, but I should mention we have a producer running this show named Rebecca Boone, who is a remarkably talented woman. I think she came from NBC or MSNBC or ESPN or something. There she is right there. That's the woman who makes us look smart tonight. Thank you, Rebecca, for being here. And Pat, you know, one of the things I learned, because when you first become a CFI, first of all, you're incredibly proud. It's a challenging rating to get. It takes a lot of study, a lot of practice. It's really worth it. But you don't know what you don't know. And whatever bad lessons you got, bad habits were passed on from your instructors, you probably take forward with you. One of them is you don't necessarily know that the airplane is a horrible, horrible classroom. There's way too much going on. At least that's been my experience. What say you, Pat Brown?
Oh, yeah. First of all, you're used to dealing with, basically forward, backwards, left, and right. And now all of a sudden you throw in the up and down. And you throw in all the noise, and you throw in ATC squawking in your ears if you're at a towered field, and all the distractions of all those round dials or pretty colors on the screen in front of you. And, look at the airplane over there that we just about hit. All of those things, all those distractions make it a very, very challenging environment. A very challenging environment. You were exactly right, Jamie. As a brand new CFI, you don't know what you don't know.
Well, and Kay, I don't even think it matters if you're in an old school steam gauge airplane, round gauges, or a brand new airplane with glass and all the modern conveniences. You're on those early lessons with your CFI, and the CFI says something that makes complete sense to them, like watch your airspeed. And the student just freaks out going, where is that? I have no idea. I mean, isn't that the case, Kay, where it's just we speak in a language that we've become very comfortable with, but that person has no idea what we're talking about?
Correct. And we also tend to use acronyms, and we might say VSI, and the student doesn't even know what instrument that is, yet alone what that acronym stands for. And so we got to be careful about that. This is where, you made that comment earlier that the airplane is a lousy classroom. We got to explain all those things on the ground. And pre-flight is a great time if we're going to be introducing instruments to talk about that on the ground and then show it in flight.
Fortunately, there is a great tool available to CFIs and students, Pat, the Preflight brief. I know my instruction got infinitely better when I started taking the time, just 10 minutes or so, to sit down in a quiet place with a student and talk about what are we going to do today. Don't you think that's a critical part or a critical element of a good flight lesson that's going to be productive?
Well, there are several elements of a given flight lesson that make it productive. And I know we're going to get to all three of them over the course of the next hour. But certainly, the first among equals, I would say, would be that pre-flight brief. It should be a recap of what you did last week, and then a discussion about what you're going to do this week, including, if necessary, some ground school to cover that. For example, if you're going to do S-turns across the road, it would be helpful as a part of your pre-flight brief to actually take the student out to the tarmac and maybe pick an expansion joint or something like that and literally walk around showing where the steep bank should be based on the wind and so on and so forth. Same thing with turns about a point, with chandelles, lazy eights on pylons, any maneuver that's being introduced to a student for the first time ought to be done with a really good, thorough pre-flight briefing / ground school lesson.
Yeah, and I got to admit, I've done that myself, and I know some people might feel like you're an idiot, but I'll take a painted line on the ground or lay a piece of tape on the hangar floor. And whether I'm using that as a runway or a road to do S's across, whatever, being able to get it into the student's head, what we're trying to do is huge. And Kay, on the back side of that, at the end of a lesson, rather than just say, hey, go to the desk and book your next flight and I'll see you next time, it's worth spending some time with that same student to do a post-flight debrief, isn't it?
Absolutely. The post-flight debrief is just as important as a pre-flight briefing. This is an important aspect of every single lesson. And it's where the student finds out, well, how did they do on the lesson and what can they improve on? This is the opportunity to ask questions that are just too difficult to ask or answer in flight. And so the post-flight debrief is the perfect place to also prepare the student for what's going to happen at the next lesson, because it should never be a surprise. You should always have that bird's eye view of your entire training, but then also a very detailed view of what are we going to do in this lesson? What are we going to do in the next lesson? How did we do? What are the performance standards? Did I meet those standards? What do I need to work on? And it's also the opportunity for the instructor to say, hey, between now and maybe 2 days or 3 days when your next flight lesson is, I'd like you to go through this material. It might be a video, it might be a portion of an online course, an article to read. Whatever it is, that's when it should be assigned. And I know later in the program we're going to talk about the syllabus and this great new AOPA training app that we have, so I won't get into that now, but that's where those things are assigned. It's really important. Oftentimes I see people in a rush. Once that engine shuts down, they're ready to sign the logbook and leave, and they're really missing out on a critical portion of your training.
Yeah, I got to admit, I found the post-flight debrief, and I still do, find it to be one of the most important parts, even on a familiarization flight. The first flight I ever do with somebody, I can come back and we can talk about what we just did, the 4 fundamentals, straight and level climbs, descents, turns, and let them know this part you want to think about a little more. You want to use some rudder in the turn, that sort of thing, but also compliment them. Hey, you maintained altitude within 300 feet. That's great for first lesson. And we're going to try and get that down to less than 100 feet, plus or minus. But they go away feeling like, oh, okay, I made some progress. By the way, in the chat here, anybody who's ever had an unpleasant flight training lesson, anybody, just give me a thumbs up in the chat. And we got a couple notes here. By the way, we have Rifadul, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, sir, from Bangladesh. That might be one of the longest distance people we've ever had in. That's fantastic. Bernard C. says, Kay, Pat, and Jamie, at the airport with bad internet today. I know bad internet, don't I, Pat?
Yes, you do.
Yeah, that's why I'm in the studio, not at the house. And I should say, I've got Starlink set up at the house now, so I can improve on that. But
hey, let me can I add one thing to Kay's comments? What I have always found helpful is when you sit down with a student after the flight, is ask the student, how do you think it went? That will give you as a CFI an incredible amount of insight into the student's thinking. So how do you think it went? And I'm telling you, you'll be surprised at the fact they know how it went. And they'll be able to tell you that it probably, in their own words, the things that you're going to tell them if you just give them the chance to do it.
Absolutely. One of the things that's fascinating that you learn as a CFI that you don't necessarily learn in CFI school, it's the same maneuvers. It's, normal takeoff and landing, short field takeoff and landing, soft field takeoff and landing, steep turns, all that stuff. Everything's the same, but every student is different. Their motivation is different. Their perception is different. Their anxiety level is different. And you're exactly right, Pat. Asking them at the end of the lesson, how did you think it went, gives you real insight into how they perceive that process, which allows the CFI to do a better and better job with that student, because the next student might have a very different tolerance level. So, by the way, we've got Connor Wilder says 61 days till AirVenture, and he's going to be helping out the whole week. Thank you. Volunteers are what make these events work. So, Connor, thanks so much for being a participant. We appreciate it. Vicky Croston says hi to Pat and is giving him full credit for sending the AOPA hat, which is this thing right here. And you know, I think we should find a way to give one of these away today, because it is, Vicky will tell you, it's a great hat. It's a truly terrific hat. And one nice thing about AOPA hats, no button on the top. So when your headset is on your head, doesn't bother you a bit. Life is good. Francesca's hi from New York. I just shipped family back to New York the other day, and it's still chilly up there, I heard. Let's see. Martin Castlemom says, I can honestly say that I have not had a bad experience with an instructor. I unfortunately have. So good for you, Martin.
Hey,
pilot.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, read the last line that Martin said, though.
My last flight review was great.
Guess who did his last flight review?
I'm thinking it's not Kay Sundaram. Carlos is a wise man. Welcome to the party, Carlos. Carlos says, keep the hat. I want the tiger. That's a guy who has priorities. I like that a lot.
I'm not eligible for. None of us, the three of us, are not eligible.
I think that's wrong. I think, and we've all seen that airplane up close. It's nice. It's really nice. So my best to you, Carlos. I hope you get it. Jay Little says, this is a good question. And with 3 CFIs here, I like it. Should you learn dial gauges, analog gauges, the old steam gauges, before learning glass panels? Let's go around the room. Kay, what's your thought on this? As a primary student, should you do glass before you do analog?
You know what? It depends on what you're going to be using your license for. And if you're going to be purchasing an airplane that is glass, then I suggest that you start with the glass panel. There's no need to go back and forth if you already know that, all right, I'm going to fly this aircraft and it has a G1000 in it, then I suggest that you start in it. However, I am old school and I did not switch over to all this technology. As much as I love technology in the cockpit, you know, I started with the 6-pack and it was all about pilotage and dead reckoning. And it was like that for about 25 years before I really got into some of the more advanced cockpits, the technically advanced aircraft, the TAA. And so I fully appreciate the old school way of training with the 6-pack. But keep in mind that even in TAA airplanes, the backup systems are sometimes analog or they might be electric, but you can see those dials. So there's some value, and I'm not trying to skirt the answer there. It really depends on what type of airplane you're going to fly in the future. If you have no intentions of flying some of these TAA aircraft, then stick with the 6-pack.
Those are good points. Pat, what's your feeling on this? Glass or analog? Does the order matter, or can you just go with one and ignore the other?
Well, you know, I will probably be accused of being some sort of Luddite here, but I'm not a fan of glass panels for initial PPL training for a number of reasons. One is people get fixated badly enough on the round dials, but when you put a pretty picture in front of them, like a big TV screen, they get even more fixated on that. And they try to, if you're told to hold 270 on the heading, if it says 271, which is what it'll say, you'll try to correct back to 270 and you'll end up at 265. And so now all of a sudden you're flying like this through the skies. It will take you longer to learn in an airplane that's a glass panel with all the buttons and knobs and bells and whistles. It will take you 10 or 15 hours longer to achieve your private pilot certificate. That's just more money. So for those and many, many other reasons, I am very old school when it comes to primary training. It's easier to transition from steam gauges, round dials, to to glass than it is to transition from glass to round dials, especially when you're trying to learn to interpret instruments. So I know I'm not in the mainstream probably by any stretch of the imagination. I'll get flamed for this, but I'll still stand by it. I've had too much experience as a CFI to think otherwise.
Yeah, actually, I agree with you, Pat. And I realize I'm a dinosaur. I'm a very, very old man, couple 100 years old. But we actually have been flying successfully with analog gauges for over 100 years. You know, the first instrument flights were done on round dials and everything. And I'm a big believer in look out the window. I just want those gauges as a reference, kind of like driving a car down the highway. You don't stare at the speedometer. You just look down at it briefly, hopefully. But the glass, you're right, it does tend to get people to fixate. It's a great tool, an absolutely great tool. But I like start with analog, work your way up to glass if you choose to. Or you may discover you're like me, you like Cubs, you like Champs, you like Stearman, things that really, I just look out the window and I'm fine. I set the throttle by ear and I'm good. By the way,
I'm going to say one other thing though. Now, in this day and age, a lot of the kids are very tech savvy, and with the video games, they can jump into the cockpit and completely understand what's on a primary flight display. And
that is true. I will offer one other thing though. I'll offer one more thing in defense of it. Analog gauges for a primary training airplane, the plane's usually cheaper, because those glass panels are very expensive. They're fantastic. They're lighter. They've got all kinds of advantages. But an airplane with analog gauges is probably less expensive to rent. And I've always told people, you're looking for the slowest, least expensive airworthy airplane you can find, because you're building time, not distance. So, by the way, we got some interesting comments here. Like Bernard C. was answering a question about, have you ever had a bad flight training experience? He surely has. He moved on to a new instructor. I've had that experience. There's nothing wrong with just telling the chief pilot or instructor, this isn't working, right, Kay? I mean, if you're flying with somebody, it's just not, you're not communicating well. It's not an insult to say, I'd like to go with somebody else. But
the most important decision that you'll make in your flight training, other than having an airworthy airplane, is the instructor that you pick. The school might assign you one, but it's ultimately your choice. And as a customer, you want to make sure that you have a very good rapport with that instructor. You're going to be not only sitting in tight quarters, but your training is dependent on that relationship. And if it's not good, it's incumbent on you to go ahead and make that change. And there's absolutely nothing wrong at all. And I think a lot of students are very hesitant that, and when an instructor is assigned to them, if it's not going well, they don't want to say anything, and they go through their entire training and they're really missing out. So speak up, and you're not going to get criticized. You'll get your instructor assigned.
By the way, we got a great comment from Juan Ignacio Elias, and I like this. This is a guy with goals. Pat says, thank you for everything you do as AOPA ambassadors. Pat, expect to see me as a commercial pilot applicant in Houston in the coming months. I like that when somebody's like, I'm doing this, and Martin Castenbaum's right behind him saying, yep, I'm doing it too. So you got some business coming, DPE boy.
Love it.
Antonio, good evening to you as well. Francesca still loves the analog too. And yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with liking one or the other over. I've owned planes with both. I like them both, but just from a initial instruction thing, I like analog. But Kay is correct. Kids today are much more tech savvy, and they may adapt well. Steam gauge, John Matthews, yes, steam gauges can be less sensitive. Then again, if you have an overheated glass panel or something like that, they can get a little glitchy, which is why there's backups. Ed Q says, trivia point. I love trivia. Don't you guys love trivia? Trivia. The first vertical tape instruments were built in 1925 by Sperry. Wow, that's pretty impressive. That was... I don't know why I'm blanking out his name. The guy who did the flight bombing Japan off the Hornet, Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle worked for Sperry and got that stuff done. They were pretty impressive. Erdem said, and we've seen Erdem before. I like this. People coming back. We've had Ed before. Last Saturday, I've covered my students' instrument panel for teaching no instrument flight training. And real rope break happened. It was scary time. Oh, okay, we're talking about a glider.
Yeah.
So, Pat, you've got some glider experience. Have you ever had a rope break as a
Yeah.
student or an instructor?
Oh yeah, I've had rope breaks for real. I've had rope breaks when you're doing training. And by the way, you generally pull the rope at about 200 feet AGL, and you can make it back to the field. I've also been on a winch tow and had a winch tow rope break. And when you're going uphill at about that pitch attitude right there, your airspeed decays very, very quickly. And you have to push that nose down very, very aggressively. And if there's anything in your lap, it becomes airborne and then just starts to turn like this while it's weightless until it becomes not weightless anymore. Then right back down on your lap like that. It's an experience.
That's one of those interesting things we started this off with. You don't know what you don't know. But that point right there that you're going from high pitch angle, low airspeed, and it's degrading rapidly, to low pitch angle to build airspeed, that's a very aggressive push. And they weren't teaching that when I learned to fly, and they are now, that if you have a failure, a power failure, a rope break on takeoff, it's a very aggressive pushover to unload the wing and get yourself into a better angle of attack. So thank you, Pat. I appreciate having your glider experience.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
And by the way, along Erdem's point, I had a flight instructor who was great. I mentioned him before, Todd, but he was the king of suction cups, and he taught me to be the king of suction cups. And when I was teaching, even private pilots, I would very often cover things up just to simulate the failure of the instrument because, well, I was flying in Connecticut once with a student who was a really good student. She was top notch, maybe the best student I ever had. And there was another airport 9 miles up the valley, and there's a guy on the frequency just freaking out because his airspeed indicator quit. And to show her that this is not a big deal, I just covered up everything. And I said, I'm going to go around the pattern a couple times. You uncover anything you want. I'm going to be within 100 feet and 5 knots all the time. And of course, as a CFI, you're doing it all the time. You're pretty good at it. But the point was, you don't need any of those gauges. As long as you're in VFR conditions, you can look out the window. You can hear the engine. You can set pitch and power, and you're pretty much fine. But that's one of those things you learn with experience. I didn't know to do that on the first day.
And Jamie, in a glass cockpit, the instructor just reaches over to the knob and turns down the light. You dim it all the way so that it's black, and then you're forced to look out the window. And that's a good trick to use when students are fixating on that PFD. Then just dim it so that they can't see it anymore.
I've done the same thing on flight reviews, Pat and Kay. I'm sure you have. If I'm doing a flight review and I realize somebody can't navigate without the GPS, you're about to have a power failure. I want you to get me home without that. Let's see. Antonio says, I love the analog gauges. I learned to fly on those with ADF and VORs. Did you have ADFs when you came through, Kay? You've been flying a long time.
Yeah, I did. I had to shoot an NDB approach on my instrument check ride.
Yep.
17. And then it was a windy day, and I don't know if I could do that now.
I know I can't, but that's that card you can pull when some young whippersnapper's telling you how great they are. I have done NDB holds, champ. So let's see. Jack Connor says, I'm still great friends with my CFIs 42 years ago. I am as well. Pat, I know you've told the story about running into your original CFI. Kay, are you still in touch with any of your old CFIs?
I'm not.
I don't know that it's normal. I think some of us are a little weird, and I've just gone out of my way to stay in touch. But John Matthews says, my favorite instructors between mentors and encouragers. I don't think you can say too much about the power of a CFI being encouraging to their students. I don't think being that gruff guy who yells and screams and grumbles and everything's not right, they're looking to you as an authority. They see the CFI, the student sees the CFI as somebody who's really got a lot to share. And by being friendly and upbeat and encouraging and telling them when they're doing things wrong and trying to refine that, but encouraging them on their improvements, I think that's critical. Pat, have you had experience with students who have just kind of come out of their shell because they maybe felt like they couldn't do it, and then you pointed out that they could, and they got better?
Yeah, it's that's kind of an acquired skill, I think, as a CFI. We talked a little bit ago about what you start out with, Jamie. You don't know what you don't know, and I'm firmly convinced that it takes probably a couple of 100 hours as a CFI before you are really much more than just a safety pilot to keep the student from killing you and him or her. And part of that learning how to become value added, if you will, as a CFI, is figuring out how to complement the student in a way that makes sense for that student. You don't want to give people just meaningless feel good stuff if they don't deserve it, but you have to find ways to keep their spirits up when they're having problems, when they're at a plateau, which they'll all get to at some point or another, multiple times, usually during flight training. They'll reach a plateau, and at some point you've got to figure out how to be that father confessor, psychologist, high school guidance counselor, or whatever, to make them feel good about where they are, and let them know that they're not alone, and other people have been in the same place before and will be again. And I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's a skill. That's a skill that is an acquired skill.
And wrapping right into that is the concept of let the student fly. I know this seems obvious, but I can't tell you how many times I've been on a first lesson with somebody who had done an introductory lesson elsewhere with another instructor, and they were stunned that I had them on the controls when we were taxiing, have them following me through when we're taking off, and they usually have the airplane by 200 feet AGL or so, and I let them fly the majority of the lesson. But I'm astounded that people come and say, I've done introductory flights, or I did a couple lessons with somebody, but I didn't actually get to fly the airplane. Kay, what's your thought on letting the student fly? I mean, there's a certain amount that the instructor has to show them, but what percentage do you let them fly even early on?
I think it's so important to actually do it, to fly. It's one thing to watch somebody or to hear them talk through a maneuver or task. It's another thing to actually do it. And so without having that experience, then you're never going to be able to get your certificate. So the earlier in your training that the instructor lets you do all these items, the more beneficial it is to the student. That's the way you get the feel, and you learn all the details. It's by doing. It's never by watching. And so it's absolutely critical that the student is actually flying. And that starts from the very beginning when you're learning the basics, the four fundamentals: straight and level, climb, descents, and turns, and then combinations of those. That starts right from day one. So you got to let the student fly. And sometimes, unfortunately, some instructors might be timid on certain things, emergency procedures, or flying in IMC. And if you're in your instrument rating and you actually haven't flown in IMC, then you need to get that experience. And if your CFII doesn't want to actually take you in those conditions, then you got to find another CFII that will. And you need to fly in those actual conditions, not just simulated.
Yeah, and Pat, talking about letting the student fly, I think one of the most important tools we have as flight instructors is the demonstration performance method. I'm a huge fan of this. I use it a lot. I benefited from it as a student. I still benefit from it when I fly a new airplane and somebody's checking me out. I think the importance of it is you go into the demonstration performance method where I'm going to fly the maneuver, but you as the student realize I'm about to give it to you. So I'm flying the maneuver and talking through it. Do you see value in that where there's that switch off, but the student is always engaged mentally, knowing I'm not just here for a ride. Whatever that instructor's doing, I'm going to have to mimic that in a minute.
Well, I think that it is a little bit of a case-by-case basis. I think that particular style of teaching has its place. Um, my experience anyway has been that, as you both know, different students learn in different ways. If you have a, if you let's talk about S turns across the road just for grins. Let's say that you have a student that's done a really, really good job of in early lessons of just flying the airplane straight and level, and maybe being able to maintain altitude in banks and such, and maintaining airspeed, and so on and so forth. And you've done a really, really good, thorough job of talking through S turns across the road by walking, along the expansion joints in the airport or whatever. It may be quite appropriate to say, okay, Joe or Jill, remember how we talked about flying across the road, and then we're going to start a bank, and it's going to be the steepest part of the bank. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through this while you do it. So I think it really depends on the student, and that type of instructional technique certainly has its place, and it can be very, very effective. But I do think and it also depends on where you are in flight training too. You might ought to demonstrate a lazy 8, for example, in commercial training, or a chandelle. It's very difficult to talk somebody through something like that. Even 8s on pylons, maybe you really do need to demonstrate first so that they can get a look at what it really looks like or should look like. But I'm going on and on. But basically, I think it's a case by case basis.
No, I like that. I agree with you. And by the way, maybe the most important question we ever get, and I've heard this one before from Jay Little: how do you keep your enthusiasm as a student when the CFI you're working with is only there to build hours to get to the airlines? Kay, I'm going to come to you for your impression on this, but let me preface it by saying this. You cannot be a CFI without building hours. It's a byproduct of the job. If the reason you're there is to build hours, find another job, because you're taking money from people to help them achieve this goal. And if helping them isn't your goal, you shouldn't be sitting there. Kay, what do you think? How can Jay Little handle a thing where they just feel like their instructor's just emptying their checking account and building hours on their wallet?
Now, let me, I got two opinions on that, so let me share both of those. First of all, there are a lot of instructors out there that are really good, that are trying to make it to the airlines. They do have to build those hours, but they are really, really good. So don't assume, first of all, that just because somebody aspires to be a corporate pilot or an airline pilot, that will by default make them be a bad instructor. That's not true. That's number one. Now, number two, if you do find an instructor who all they want to do is build hours, and they don't really care about your success or your goals, and they're just emptying your wallet, then you got to find another instructor. So it really depends on the dynamics and that individual, but don't assume that because they're building hours that they're not going to be a good instructor, because I've personally flown with a number of instructors who, they aspire to be an airline pilot. They know that the flight school knows that they're only going to be there for a couple of years, and then they're going to take off into another endeavor, and that's okay. They can still be really good. So it depends on that dynamics, and the key is having a great relationship with the instructor and making sure that you're getting those elements, the pre-flight, a quality flight lesson, and then the post-flight, and they're following up with you in between lessons, assigning you, homework and things to do. If they're doing all of that, you're probably going to miss them when they go off to the airlines.
Kay, you brought up a really good point here about having a relationship with your flight instructor, that it's a symbiotic kind of thing. They're getting income and hours. You're getting their insight and experience and learning how to fly. It's so important. And you're absolutely right. There are people who are good instructors who are working their way up to a higher level, and that's perfectly fine. But if all they're doing is building the time and they're not trying to help you, that's a challenge. And I'll share, I had a friend who was learning to fly a couple of years ago, and he called me up really concerned, said, I can't land. I just can't land. I'm horrible at it. And we talked about things, and I asked, what's your configuration? What's your airspeed? What are you looking at? And he didn't know the answer to any of those questions. And I said, how much time do you have? And he said, 5 hours. Well, I chuckled. You're not supposed to be able to land in 5 hours. A couple of weeks later, I get the same phone call, same problem, but now he's at 15 hours. And I asked him, well, when the instructor demonstrates it, are you doing it the same way he's doing it? He says, he's never demonstrated it. He just tells me what to do. Well, that's to your point, Pat. If you've never seen somebody land a plane, you're not going to accidentally figure it out, even with pointers. So yeah, it's to what you said earlier, Kay, it really is incumbent on the student to fly with an instructor they like flying with, where they're making progress, where they feel good. Unfortunately, this industry has a fairly high dropout rate because people don't realize you should be a conscientious consumer. You should make sure you're getting what you want. And to that point, Kay, probably a good idea if your instructor is using a syllabus or a tool like AFTA, where they're actually communicating with you, where are we in the process, how are you doing, what comes next. What are your thoughts on syllabus or using something new like the AFTA app?
Oh, I think the syllabus is a must. Every instructor has got to have a syllabus, and every student needs to have that bird's eye view. You know, what is it that we need to accomplish to get my certificate or rating? And they need to know that it's a roadmap, right? And then they need to see their progress along the way. Well, what have I accomplished so far? What do I have to repeat? And what are the next steps? And so you don't want to have a CFI who asks the student, well, what do you want to do today? Or what should we do today? Or what did we do last time? Or did we do this yet? Now that's a huge red flag. You got to have a plan, make sure that your student knows what that plan is, and then you're using the lesson time to accomplish the plan. And then you'll amend things as it's needed. You might plan to do steep turns and some other maneuvers, but then you get up there and you need more time on the steep turns, and so you don't get to the second task, and that's okay. But having that plan and everyone knowing about it ahead of time is really important. And as far as tools, yeah, AOPA, we got a great tool called AFTA. It's AOPA Flight Training Advantage. And Rebecca, could we put the website up for that and a screenshot? So this is a training app. It's a web portal. And it's iPad-based training app that's going to help make the process of flight training more efficient for the student, the flight instructor, and the flight school. And what's nice about this is that it's the app. It customizes each student's lessons just for them because it keeps pace with their progress. The instructor is adding in their notes, how did the student perform, and then the app will automatically customize what's going to be done the next time. So students can see how they've performed with a lot of details in the lesson history. They can access this on their phone or computer or their mobile device, and they can check in on their training progress. And the other great thing about this app is that you can access videos and articles. It's a full library. It's just one-stop shopping. And so at the end of the day, the student saves a lot of time and money by because their training is streamlined. So I love it.
Yeah.
Check it out on their website.
Yeah, and there's, for those of you on the other side of this camera, that's the web address, aopa.org/Alpha Foxtrot Tango Alpha. You can learn all about it. And I believe we are allowed to say that's a member benefit. So if you belong to AOPA, you have access to AFTA. And it really is, it's designed for the student to be more productive by being actively involved with their instructor. Pat, I'm coming to you. I love Christopher Ritchie's question. Is an applicant, a student pilot, allowed to ask a designated pilot examiner for recommendations for a flight instructor? If I'm a student, Pat, and I come out to West Houston and I say, hey, I'm thinking of learning to fly, is there any place I might go and have a good experience? Are you allowed to answer that, or does the federal government prohibit you on pain of death?
No, we can answer questions like that, and frankly, we're very happy to answer questions like that because typically we pretty well know the schools in the area that do the best job, frankly, of training students, because we see students and the products of every single one of these flight schools. on a pretty regular basis. So I would suggest to you that a DPE would be an excellent source to go and ask for a recommendation for a flight school. Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that because people often don't realize you're allowed to ask around. DPEs are not nearly as evil as they look. They're actually generally pretty nice women and men. They're flight instructors. They love to fly just like we are. We do, and you can go talk to them. By the way, I have to ask for a follow-up from Jack Connors. He learned to fly in Connecticut on an 1,100-foot runway. I soloed at Hartford Brainerd, which is considerably longer than that, but I got to know which airport, Jack. I'm fascinated. By the way, we haven't actually touched on one of the most important topics in this one, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't. Safety is really important. And one of the downsides of being a flight instructor, if you don't stay on your toes, is it is by nature a very repetitive job. You're doing the same, if you're mostly doing primary students, you're doing the same maneuvers, the same things over and over. And just human nature, if you tend to get slack and say, you know what, we don't have to do clearing turns before we do this. That's a problem because there's a reason we do clearing turns. And Pat, what happens if my student goes on a check ride and you say, let's see a steep turn, and they say, okay, and roll right into it?
Bust.
Yeah, and it is because safety, right? I mean, it's not an arbitrary rule. We're trying to establish a pattern of behavior where safety is primary throughout your flying. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and the ACS very clearly talks about that. So I mean, it's not just something that's arbitrary, but the ACS, the Airman Certification Standards, are very clear on that. So so pay attention to that stuff.
Yeah, and Jack Connors comes back and says, Meriden, Connecticut. This is stunning. I actually instructed at Meriden Markham. So what are the odds? Runway 1836 with Meriden Mountain right in the way. It was awesome. Nice to meet you, Jack. Who knows? We might have been in the pattern together at one time. Okay, what about a basic thing, the proper exchange of controls? There actually have been aircraft accidents because both people thought the other one was flying the airplane. There actually is a way, right from the beginning of flight training, how to exchange controls with the CFI and the student. How do you go about that?
Oh, it's from lesson number 1. You tell the student, okay, if I want the flight controls, I'm going to say, I have the flight controls. And then they reiterate and say, you have the flight controls. And then the instructor says, I have the flight controls. So it's a 3-step statement there. And it's really important that you do that right from the beginning so that you know who has the flight controls. And don't say, I have the airplane, because that can be confusing, because if you're pointing out, oh, the traffic, I have the airplane. But with the flight controls, it's always, I have the flight controls, you have the flight controls, and then you reiterate that. And that's a step that even the professionals do all the time. So start with that right from the beginning. And I believe, Pat, if you don't do that on the check ride, that can get you in trouble, correct?
There's a lot of things that can get you in trouble on the check ride. It's usually a matter of the dominoes start to fall, as to which one might be the one that finally gets you. But
it's not so much about the check ride. It's just good habit. There should be absolutely no confusion in any cockpit as to who is flying the airplane.
Yeah.
That's what that's all about.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it is an unfortunate thing, but seriously, there have been accidents, and there are certainly stories where people are flying along with their buddy and saying, I can't believe he's getting this close to the trees. And the other guy's thinking, I can't believe he's this low. They both think the other one's flying the airplane. By the way, Christopher Ritchie put something up. Pat, I'm going to come to you on this because it's interesting. He says, flight instruction, and making progress. It's one of the reasons why he wants to record his flight lessons on a GoPro in case the flight instructor leaves. And the flight instructor very well may leave. And I actually have 3 GoPros mounted on the airplane. I use them a lot because I do in-flight things. But, Pat, to my mind, especially early on, that's a distraction, and a distraction you probably don't need, where you're checking the camera to make sure you turned it on or whatever. Do you have thoughts on using GoPro? Because there are people who like doing it. It's just I only do it if I have a compelling reason. I'd rather use my logbook to record my flights.
Honestly, I don't have a really strong opinion about that one way or the other. If someone wants to set up a GoPro and record the flight lesson, it's absolutely a no on a check ride. But if I'm acting as a flight instructor and somebody wants to record the lesson, I have no real strong feelings about that. However, if I do notice that they've got their phone down here, we're doing the run up and they're trying to make sure that the camera's running, or they're reaching back here, and okay, at that point, let's stop here a second. This is becoming a distraction. But if they can pretty much set it up and click something and it's out of sight, out of mind, I don't care.
That's a really good point. I should probably qualify what I said. If it is becoming a distraction, if it is causing you to divide your attention, that's not great. But if you're able to just mount it back there and it's shooting forward and you turn it on and that's it, great. And I actually have a plug-in for mine so I get the audio. So,
something I like to use
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kay.
Something I like to use is the breadcrumbs. Most of us fly with some sort of aviation app, whether it's ForeFlight or WingX, Garmin Pilot, and they all have it's the track that you flew, and it includes not just an overlay on the map, but also your speeds and altitudes, and that could be a good debriefing tool. And for to go back and take a look, and if they took some pictures along the way, then you can tell by the timestamp where you were on those breadcrumbs. And I find that to be really helpful, especially in for instrument approaches. You can really tell where you were on your airspeed, and you can only see so much from the video. And I do love the idea of being able to watch something that's been taken on GoPro. However, that breadcrumbs has a lot of detailed information of your actual flight.
Yeah, that's a good point. I tend to use Flight Aware, and especially if you're working with a primary student doing pattern work, you can go back and look at that and see how consistent were your patterns. Were they very different shapes and sizes, and were you making turns at different points? Maybe that's why you're having trouble getting consistent landings. That's a really good point, Kay. Thanks for pointing that out. Eric Yates, who is a peer of ours up at AOPA in Frederick, involved with the high school program, says another characteristic of a good instructor is they'll make lessons fun missions, scenario-based training. He'd give his students a scavenger hunt and riddles that made lessons a hoot. And yeah, you can do a lot of creative things to keep people engaged, or even I will out myself. And this leads into the next thing. If your student is really struggling, it's okay to move on to the next thing. For me, it was turns around a point. I couldn't do a turn around a point to save my life. I could do S's across the road. I could do rectangular patterns. I could not do turns around a point. They were a mess. And I would get so frustrated. I mean, really on the verge of tears. I just couldn't figure out why I couldn't do it. And my instructor was great, because if I was getting frustrated and not getting there, we'd break off and go do something else that I could do, like S's across the road. But then he gave me, one day we were going out and he knew I was having trouble with it, and he gave me a pointer that nobody had ever said. I didn't see it in a book. And he was basically saying, pick some landmarks that are equidistant from the thing you're trying to turn around, and make sure you adjust your flight path to pass over those things. It was like, oh, okay, the light went on. I got it now. It's easier. But yeah, if your student's just frustrated and can't get it, Pat, it's okay to move on, isn't it? I mean, it's okay to break that lesson off. We don't have to spend an hour and 15 minutes doing the thing that's driving you crazy and you're making no progress.
It's probably better not to do that, because now, you're just, it's frustration on top of frustration on top of frustration. At some point, it becomes not fun anymore. And you might lose that person as a student over nothing.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but it's true. And Kay, frustration is something we have to deal with. Learning to fly is not natural. It's not easy. It requires a lot of study. As you point out, we need the pre-flight brief, but we also need the post-flight debrief and some sense from our instructor what's in the next lesson so we can study for it. I think it's worth saying out loud. There are times this is going to be the most wonderful experience you've ever had, and there are times where it's going to be tremendously frustrating when you hit a learning plateau and just feel like you can't make progress. But that's not the end of the world, is it? I mean, learning plateaus are known things, so there's a solution.
And this is the case for everyone. everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and some people are good in steep turns, others are good, very comfortable with all the emergency procedures and landings, and some are good in crosswind takeoffs and landings, and some are not. And so we all have strengths and weaknesses, and so the key is to remember that you're learning. And we are all learning. Even as CFIs, we go back and we fly with other instructors, and we never get to a point where we know it all. And so if you do get frustrated, just remember that you're not alone, and that is a normal process. Just try to have fun. When you can look forward to your flight lesson, then that learning becomes easier. If you focus on the struggles, then you're going to go down this rabbit hole where it gets harder and harder.
I like the question we just got from Jay Little. Maybe my favorite question of the day. This is awesome. What can I do as a student pilot to make flight training go smoother for my CFI? I like it because it acknowledges there's a partnership here. We both have to be getting along. I'm going to come to each of you, but I'm going to start because I'm just ego driven, and it's very important that I speak first. Be on time. If you have a 10 o'clock a.m. lesson, that doesn't mean show up at 10 o'clock. It means get there by 9:30, maybe even a little earlier than that. We want to be early and prepared, so when the airplane is ready, maybe the instructor is post-flight debriefing with his previous student or her previous student. We could be out doing the pre-flight. We could be making sure the airplane has the fuel. We could make sure we're totally prepared for what's happening on this lesson. So when we step into the pre-flight brief, I'm on top of it. I know what we're doing. I've gone through it in my head. Let's go out and be really productive. So my suggestion is to work best with your CFI is be on time. Kay, what do you say? What's a piece of advice you could give? How can a student work with a CFI to make it more productive and enjoyable for both of them?
I would say that's really important to come prepared. So if you and your CFI had said, all right, you're going to watch this video on stalls, on slow flight and stalls, then do it and then come prepared and come with a list of questions and say, hey, I don't really understand this whole concept of stalls, and that gives an opportunity to focus on some of those areas where you need to discuss on the ground, so that when you get up in the air, it will make more sense. As we talked about earlier, the airplane is a lousy place to learn some of these ground lessons. And so come prepared. And I understand that life gets in the way, and sometimes you might be busy and you can't do what you were planning to do. And that's all right once in a while, but don't make that a habit every single time, because it's just going to cost you more money. So if you come prepared, then I promise you your flight training is going to be a lot more efficient and more fun.
That is two pieces of advice that are going to make life much easier. Be on time and be prepared. Pat, you want to fill out the triumvirate here and give us one more piece of advice that will make it easier for Jay Little or anyone else to work productively with their CFI?
You bet. First of all, I agree wholeheartedly with what both of you said. Those would have been top of my list. And number three for me would be work to develop the kind of relationship with your flight instructor that allows you to speak frankly with your flight instructor. For example, I would hope that the relationship I had with the students when I was teaching on a relatively full-time basis was such that if something wasn't working for one of us, that we could bring that up in a respectful conversation, regardless of what the situation was. So nurturing the kind of relationship, and it's a two-way street, it's a partnership, where you can have serious, frank conversations about anything. Because as somebody pointed out earlier in one of the comments, we're the priest, the minister, the counselor, we're the psychologist, we're all those things. And sometimes somebody may be having some personal problems or something to get in the way of their flight training. Well, sometimes they just need somebody to talk to. So in addition to the things that the two of you brought up, which are critically important, I would add the third is try to foster that relationship where you can really talk candidly and frankly, and respectfully, of course, if it's issues with something that the CFI or the student's doing that's just really just bad. So that would be mine.
I like that. I like that a lot, because that soft skill of recognizing you have a relationship. And as Kay said before, you're going to be in relatively tight quarters under what you perceive as a fairly high workload with somebody that you really have to get along with, at least on the professional level. But it would be great, as you say, Pat, we all go through things in life, and be able to express frustration or excitement or trust them when you say, am I really ready for this check ride? I mean, there's so much that I was working with a student years ago in Connecticut, Meriden, Jack, and we were doing turns under the hood. And there's ridge lines in Connecticut, and he was getting very low and very close to the ridge line. So I said, my controls. And he's like, no, I got it. And I'm like, no, my controls. It's not I'm not asking you. But that's that thing where you have to have that relationship with your CFI, because so much of what we do is subjective. It's all judgment based. Should I go on this flight or not? Do I have enough fuel to make that leg, or should I find someplace closer? Is the weather really up to what I need it to be for this, or am I putting undue pressure on myself? All that will be judgmental, and that will come because you've had a relationship with a CFI who assures you it's okay to say no. It's okay to say, I'm not prepared for this. It's perfectly all right. So, by the way, Antonio has a very good question that I hear a lot. Are students required to practice spins? No. Not in the United States. The only time you have to spin is to go get your flight instructor certificate. But Pat, and I'm coming to you because you're a DPE, this is my personal thing. I don't think spin should be a big worry, because if you don't stall, you won't spin. And even if you do stall, if you stay coordinated, you won't spin. What's your theory on this thing? Should people be worried about the spins?
Well, the easiest way to not be afraid of spins is to go out and do spins. If spins scare you, then embrace the fear and go find somebody that you can get some spin training from, because there's nothing to be afraid of. It's nothing to be scared of. It's not an abnormal flight regime. Spins used to be taught routinely. This was back in the 40s and early 50s. I don't remember exactly when it was abandoned, but it was somewhere back around in that time frame. So there's no reason to be afraid of spins. The first time or two, it'll be kind of a, whoa, that was fun. But after a few times, really, and you become desensitized to it, and 1 or 2 turn spin is not a big deal. But you're right, Jamie. If the airplane is coordinated, it won't spin. And typically, if it does, in most modern light airplanes, literally, if you just let go of the controls, it will stop spinning. That is not a universally true statement, depending on the airplane that you're flying. But generally speaking, just let go of the controls, and it'll stop. So I hope that answers the question.
I think that's a great answer, Pat. You did terrific. And we'll close out here with Real Flying Cowboy, because this was my experience. And I think this happens to a lot of people, frankly. My first flight instructor really turned me off, so I quit. 12 years later, I started again, and it started off bad. Then that instructor left, which was a blessing. My third instructor was great. That was my exact experience. My first couple instructors were not good instructors. I really didn't make progress. I mostly just paid a salary for somebody and rented a plane. My first 4 flights were in 3 different types. I didn't know that was dumb, but you can be successful. If you do what Kay said and just ask around, don't let them assign you the instructor necessarily. Interview them, talk to them. You're spending a fair amount of money. This is what Pat and Kay and I do. We want to encourage you, because you can be successful at this. And whether you use the AFTA app, which is now an AOPA member benefit, or if you use a syllabus that your flight school is good with, or you pick a flight instructor that you're really comfortable with and you're set to go, whether you're dealing with analog or glass, you can be successful. But a big part of it is up to you. So be on time, be prepared, and develop that relationship with your CFI so you don't ever have a topic that you're afraid to bring up. By the way, you can become an AOPA member right there on the screen. There's the address for it, and you can write to us if you disagree, if you have a question, if there's something you want to talk to about. First day with the new face, it's not working out. If you want to talk to us about offline about something, you can write to us, ambassadors@aopa.org. Pat Kay and I will see that, and we will respond and get back to you. Let me ask you a favor. Please click like on this video, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook. Share the link if you would, because Pat makes me say that. You know, I don't care, but Pat's really big into it. And let's all welcome Kay back from her brutal vacation in Hawaii, where she flew all over the islands. It was just, being an ambassador's hard, isn't it, Kay?
I had a lot of fun.
Folks, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We could talk about this for another 3 hours, but you probably have something to do. We'll be right back here Tuesday, June 14th, 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific. You can do the math in the middle. We would love to see you back here again. So come on back in, and it's even okay if you're a Pat fan or a K fan. I'll still talk to you. Until next time, Rebecca Boone, producer extraordinaire, thank you, ma'am. We'll see you all on June 14th. Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.